familiarize themselves. She hit the record button. Familiarize themselves with Zoom and its capabilities. And so they've been doing a great job, I think, of training people in a short fashion, obviously using online distance learning. So thank you to these people. And if we can get the next slide. This convention is planned well in advance. And so some people were saying, well, why don't you just push the date back somehow? And that would have been interesting, but also a huge challenge. We secure our physical meeting space years in advance. There's only a couple places when we do meet physically that we can hold a meeting of its size. We typically have over 500 people in our regular conference. So we distribute the workload of planning this to a number of people from both the DNR, from counties, from the River Alliance, from Wisconsin Lakes, citizen volunteers. This is the list of people that we have to thank for helping to make this agenda happen. The agenda is mostly scoped out in November and December. We kind of have a good feel for the agenda. And we were just at the point of getting ready to print the printed edition of the agenda when we learned that things were going to be different, that we weren't going to be able to meet in person. So thank you to these folks. I probably missed some people, but I tried to capture everyone who was involved. Go ahead and grab the next slide. This is the team that I've been relying on. Can't say enough about the Extension Lakes folks. You're just looking at who we are. This is us getting together for Christmas. And we're actually celebrating the retirement of our longtime friend, Kim Becken. Kim was someone, if you came to the physical convention, she was there at the registration desk, always helping people out. And after a long career at the university, she's happily retired and out on her farm out by Amherst. So just want to recognize my team. You will see them in person someday. You may see them on a Zoom meeting in sometime in the near future, but these are the people who really help make Extension Lakes work. We're a unique little unit because we sit at UW-Stevens Point. We are funded by an agreement with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to do outreach and extension work around lake organizations, lake districts. We also manage the education related to the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network and the CLEMO Clean Waters Network. We're part of the Healthy Lakes team that's working to promote shoreline restoration and stormwater practices statewide. So this is your team. Go ahead and get the next slide. And I want to extend a super warm welcome to Sarah Winju. Sarah is, in some ways, she's the replacement for Kim, but in many ways she's not. We've kind of transformed that position over time. And Sarah's title now is Leadership and Capacity Development Specialist. Sarah joins us. She was working in environmental education on campus at Stevens Point for, I think, over 10 years. So she brings a lot of background in outreach and education. Her first day with us was the first week of March. So she's had an interesting experience as a new staff member as part of the Extension Lakes team. We're super excited to have her with us, and we have a lot of ideas for programs in the future, particularly focusing on board development for lake associations and lake districts, and trying to help entire groups of people who are maybe struggling to exceed their or struggling to really realize their capacity, to realize their potential as lake organizations. There's a number of things that they could be doing, and we want to help them sort of analyze themselves and move forward with improving their capabilities. There's over 200 lake districts in the state. There's over 600 lake associations. It's a tall order, but we sort of have a plan, and you'll be hearing from us in the next couple of months as we reach out to you and try to connect. So let's go to the next slide. So we're lucky to be where we are. I guess just take a moment. Next slide. All right. This is part of the university and part of the DNR. And part of what we want to do is recognize that really wherever you are in North America, you're probably on land that didn't belong to us originally. We're new people, and the original people are still here. This is a web page you can check out on your own called The Ways. So if you Google that, you'll get to this map, but it shows the original territories that folks occupied well before European encounter. And I think Doug might be able to hit on this a little bit, but the tribes are still a very real presence on the landscape. So we want to take a moment just to recognize that this land was tribal lands. Next slide. All right. As you heard, or as you might have seen, we're recording this session. We're recording all these sessions. This is sort of lemonade out of lemons. This will be the first convention where we actually have a recording of everything. And the idea is to be able to post that into the archive. We'll be able to share those in YouTube. You can invite other people to join you and check those out. You can post them on your Facebook. You can watch them in your leisure. It's not gonna be the same because you don't get to do the Q&A. But for example, this morning, Mike Engelson was giving a pretty in-depth discussion of Wisconsin peer law and what's been happening in the Supreme Court and how that affects people on flowages. And there's a lot of confusion about that. If people are wondering what the heck that's about, I think his video is going to be a great resource. When you're in the breakout sessions outside of this space, you're going to be using the chat feature. The chat feature is going to allow you to ask your questions. And we've got moderators in the room that are going to help you out. And in this session, you're going to be using the question and answer feature. So down at that bottom list next to the number 344, there's a little Q&A box. Would encourage you to use that instead of the chat. This is going to be where you ask questions. And what's interesting about the webinar format is that you get to vote questions up. So you get to say, oh, well, that's a good question. I'd love to hear the answer to that. Click on sort of the thumbs up icon, which you can faintly see there. And that's going to move questions up to the top of the queue. We're going to have a person following the plenary speaker who's going to kind of give a response to Doug's talk. And that's going to allow you some time to maybe compose a question or vote for a question that you'd like to see answered. Next slide. All right. We did also want to try to take advantage of some of the features in Zoom. So if this works out, this is a bit of an experiment. I'll ask Megan to sort of initiate one of the polls. Hi, Megan. We're seeing you. So here's a poll for you. Which state are you joining us from? So you can just click on your answer, and this will give us a sense of where everybody's joining us from. Vast majority of us are from Wisconsin. We got about 10 people joining us from outside of the upper Midwest. So Marco Janssen, for example, is from Arizona. I'm guessing there might be some other Arizona people. All right, so let's end that poll. We had about 80% of people from Wisconsin. You can see those results now. And then we'll segue into the next poll.
Eric, do you mind reading them so that any of our viewers that are connecting via phone can at least hear what they are?
Certainly. So this question is, what do you miss most about the in-person conference? Meeting new colleagues, social time with water resource people, seeing the different exhibits, the excitement of a big event. Answers are still coming in. A lot of people basically voting for social time with the water resource people. So we know that that's a big part of what's missing when we meet like this. There's no magic remedy for that. However, we do have a Wisconsin Lakes Partnership Facebook page. At the lunch break, you're going to be encouraged to go over there, take a selfie, post a picture, give us a comment. Next question. We'll end that poll and we'll share the results, I think. Some people said no poll, so some people aren't able to see it. I'm not sure what's going on there. And the results here, again, the winning thing is social time with water resource people, not too surprising. Meeting new colleagues came in second with 26%, seeing the different exhibits, 14%, and the excitement of a big event, 8%. So let's go to the next poll. What do you miss the least about the in-person conference? And here your options include convention center food, the chairs, can't control the temperature, being away from family, time spent in the car. And I added this one today, waking up too early. When you're at the in-person convention, you often have to wake up and get dressed, shave, and do all that business. And a lot of you probably didn't do that today. So you didn't have to wake up too early. Or some people would wake up the day of the conference and they drive in hours from outside of town. So today your commute was as short as it'll ever be. This one's interesting. The answers are pretty evenly distributed. Only 9% said convention center food. 20% said the chairs. Wow, that's a winning. I'm amazed. Can't control the temperature was a tie with being away from family. Time spent in the car. People don't miss that. Waking up too early. All right, we got a couple more polls real quick. This is again just letting you warm up the room, get things started for us. What best describes your clothing situation today? Would you say you are normal clothes, pants or jeans? Did you dress up for the occasion? Fancy slacks or a dress? Wearing pajamas, sweatpants? And we're not going to get into the details, but if none of those apply, you're going to have to choose other. Some people want multiple answers to these. So a lot of people wearing normal clothes. I'm kind of surprised. I'm in pajamas myself. I do have a fancy shirt on. You probably, I don't know if you can see it, but just figured I'd take advantage of this. So wow, you people are great. Normal clothes.
We have 3 people that dressed up.
That's awesome, 1%. Let's go, I think we have one more poll, and this is the segue to our keynote presenter. What's your favorite water time activity? So what's your favorite water time activity? And again, you just have to pick one, sorry. Fishing, swimming, paddling, looking for invasive species, measuring water quality, or just watching the water and wildlife. We'll let this one run for a while till we get a good chunk of people voting. Doug and Todd have got to be excited. Fishing is coming out pretty hot on this one. Paddling and swimming are in there. Just watching water and wildlife is kind of a third of folks. All right, now you're looking at the results. Just watching the water and wildlife is a popular response. For me, right now I can look out my window. I can see the Wisconsin River. It's pretty amazing. I'm very fortunate in that regard. Fishing is very popular with people, paddling, getting out there, swimming, looking for invasive species. A couple of people, 6. Paul Skwinski might be in that group. Measuring water quality is out there. All right. Thank you, Megan, for sharing these polls. Let me scroll down over here. Well, thank you. This allowed us time again for people to get settled and to find some of the functionalities in Zoom. Again, I want to point out the Q&A is where we're going to, after the presentations, focus your questions. You'll be able to upvote other people's questions. That'll move them to the top of the list. First off, I want to introduce Todd Ambs. Todd is joining us from the Wisconsin DNR. I think he's at home. Todd, from 2003 to 2010, Todd was the DNR's Water Division Administrator, where he was the lead negotiator for the state of Wisconsin during the development of the Great Lakes Compact. Todd has worked in the environmental policy field for more than 30 years. Most recently, he was also campaign director for the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. He now serves as Assistant Deputy Secretary for Preston Cole, where he helps oversee a range of water-related programs in the state of Wisconsin at sort of the high level within the DNR. So please give a warm convention welcome to Todd Ambs. Yay.
Thanks, Eric. You hear me okay? Sounds good. Good morning. Eric is correct. I am joining you from the my home office, where I have been for most of the last 2 weeks and chunks of the time before that. Thanks for everyone's participation in this historic event. As you were going through the polling this morning, I too was one of those that said I missed the social interaction. As much as I applaud and appreciate your effort here and welcome looking at the bottom of the screen, 358 participants that are watching right now. I must say, I was enjoyed last year being able to both be there in person and play a little music with some friends at night, and look forward to returning to that next year. Change is constant, and the show must go on. It's, I'm sure, not the first one to note the serendipity associated with that. Resiliency is the theme of this convention. Wisconsin is a resilient state, and this is a good example of that. I applaud the efforts of Lakes Extension, university, and department staff that you put into this huge task of moving this event to a virtual platform, especially during this time of social distancing and all its challenges. Enjoy the next couple of days interacting and learning. In the coming weeks, as we work our way through this crisis, please also take time to reflect on nature's beauty. State parks and other state natural and wildlife areas are open, and getting outdoors is a great way to relieve stress. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. Use time by the water to relax, to think and daydream, and prepare yourself for these challenging times and changing times. This is a Lakes and Rivers convention, and I'm happy to see, as a river rat myself, the continuing integration of rivers into this great annual tradition. Lakes and rivers are resilient too. Overall, Wisconsin lakes and rivers are in pretty good shape. Though we have challenges, our state's waters are still among the nation's healthiest. 84,000 miles of rivers and streams, over 15,000 lakes, 5.3 million acres of wetlands, 1,100 miles of Great Lakes shoreline, several hundred miles of Mississippi River shoreline. Though we have challenges, with the continued support from resilient folks like you, we can keep them and improve them in the future. Thank you all for being part of the statewide effort to protect and restore our precious water resources. Enjoy the next couple of days of interacting and learning. In the coming weeks, as we work our way through this crisis, please also take time to reflect on nature's beauty. State parks are open, and getting outdoors is a great way to relieve stress, as I noted. Bear with us, the DNR and local resource managers, as we work through the most dramatic and rapid change to how we do business since World War II. This summer will not be the same as other summers. Please pay close attention to state and local authorities as they adjust travel regulations and other rules to help slow and stall the spread of COVID-19. Take time to rethink how you and your organizations, lake and river groups, consulting firms, local governments, can stay in touch and maintain function in the absence of face-to-face meetings. The department will be as fully functional as possible to assist you. At the DNR, we are literally working around the clock to respond to this crisis. But we are doing so while staying safe and staying well. Of the 3,500 DNR staff, 85% of us are now working from home on any given day. It is not easy, especially for staff with young children, and it is not preferred by anyone. But it is absolutely necessary. Our number one job as humans in this state today is to do all that we can to prevent the spread of this virus. At the same time, I want to take a moment to talk about some of the 15% of the DNR workforce who won't be working from home today. Parks staff. We made the important decision to keep our parks open, waive fees because having access to the outdoors, to our beautiful natural resources, is a critical part of our wellness during these times. But if you go to those parks, please know that you could be putting park staff in harm's way if you don't practice social distancing, stay away from the parks if you feel sick, and strictly follow the other important health cautions during this crisis. And thank park staff if you see them for what they are doing for you.
So I'm not sure if it's my feed or everyone's feed. Todd might have just...
It is everyone's.
Okay, so Todd stalled out there. Apologies for that. I think his last comments were, again, just to respect the people who do have to work outside, do everything you can to minimize contact. Everybody obviously working from home is doing so on sometimes sketchy internet connections, and our keynote speaker is going to address some of that as well. Megan, thank you again for joining me as my co-host here. Every year it's a tradition. It's been a tradition for decades, actually, to do sort of a narrated or a video or a slideshow to kind of set the mood for this meeting. And I'm often asked, you know, what is this theme about? You know, you picked a theme for the year. Can you explain it to people? And for me, the theme is, and someone's asking me to turn on my camera if you really want to say me. The theme this year is about resilience. And resilience is a complicated topic. Some people have maybe a really basic understanding of resilience, but there's actually been scientists who've been digging deep into what resilience looks like and means. Some people looking at it from the natural world and some people looking at it in terms of communities and individuals. So we took this idea of trying to explain resilience pretty seriously, and we put together a short video. We'd ask you to just sit back, kind of take in this video, contemplate what's being shown, and then after the video, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. So I'll turn this over to Megan.
How can we care for our lakes and rivers in the face of disturbances, surprises, and uncertainty? Resilience. Think of resilience as the ability of a system, be it a person, a lake, a community, or a watershed, to deal with change and still continue to thrive. By focusing on resilience, we can avoid the trap of always trying to achieve a romanticized version of what the world should be. Nature is dynamic, and change happens when we least expect it. Resilience implies that the things we need from nature and communities will still be there despite change.
What does resilience actually mean when it is put into practice? Here are 7 principles that help describe resilience thinking in action. Principle 1, maintain diversity and redundancy. Systems with many different parts, whether species, people, or knowledge sources, are generally more resilient than systems with few parts. In a shoreline planting, a diverse group of plants will be far more resilient. This approach also encourages intentional redundancy as a form of insurance. Planting several of your favorite native flowers promotes their survival in the face of hungry deer or finicky weather.
Principle 2, manage connectivity. Connectivity can be both good and bad. Well-connected systems can recover from disturbances more quickly, but overly connected systems can allow problems to spread. Rainwater moving too quickly across the land carries soil, nutrients, and other pollutants directly to our waterways. We are better off promoting slow connectivity through groundwater, and this is easily accomplished with rain gardens. These beautiful gardens capture and filter water, allowing it to soak into the ground slowly, eliminating erosion and downstream pollution. They also provide habitat for our winged neighbors.
Principle 3, manage slow variables and feedbacks. Surface water quality is linked to slowly changing variables such as the nutrients in the soils throughout the watershed. If we apply excess fertilizers to the land or cause runoff to flush nutrient-rich soil to the lake, the water's nutrient concentration will increase. Healthy lakes and rivers are resilient. They can tolerate a certain level of nutrient pollution, but too much pollution can flip a switch. Overabundant nutrients fuels fast algae growth, smothering aquatic plants, rocks, and other objects in the water. This situation can feed itself, recycling nutrients, allowing algae to increase and dominate. Rain gardens, healthy shoreline vegetation, and minimizing fertilizer are all great ways to reduce nutrient pollution.
Principle 4, foster complex adaptive systems thinking. Simple descriptions of people and nature are rarely accurate. Nature, including humans, is complex and ever-changing. Our thinking also needs to be complex and adaptive. We must accept unpredictability and uncertainty, and consider a variety of ideas and perspectives. The Wisconsin ThinkWater project is an example of people using complex adaptive systems thinking to manage lakes, rivers, and watersheds. This project mapped out a shared understanding of how local organizations provide critical resources to restore and protect lakes and landscapes. It has fueled the partnership's efforts to help local groups understand and increase their capacity. We continue to learn new things about capacity building and group effectiveness, and applying these lessons leads to better strategies to tackle water challenges.
Principle 5, encourage learning. The complex systems of people and nature are always changing, creating a constant need to revise existing knowledge and stimulate learning. Every year, the Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention brings together hundreds of lake and river stakeholders, resource managers, researchers, and educators to share knowledge and ideas. We develop new questions to explore as we look to protect in partnership our legacy of Wisconsin waters. We rely on you, the people who attend the convention, to return home and share what you've learned. This amplification of learning dramatically increases the value of our shared time and conversations at this annual gathering.
Principle 6, broaden participation. There are major advantages to fostering broad and deep participation in water resource management decisions. We all have a stake in clean, healthy waters. An informed and well-functioning partnership can build trust and foster a shared understanding. Both are fundamental ingredients for collective action. This past year, hundreds of Wisconsinites participated in hearings across the state as part of the Speaker's Task Force on Water Quality. They ranged from people concerned about lead in their city's water system, to farmers seeking support to try out new conservation practices, to anglers and swimmers concerned about harmful algae blooms. This broad base of support helps elected lawmakers take actions to enact the task force's recommendations.
Principle 7, promote polycentric governance. Systems of polycentric governance feature many governing bodies interacting to address problems. This approach is one of the best ways to achieve collective action in the face of disturbance and change. It fosters flexible solutions and self-organization at times when more formal and centralized approaches seem to fail. The Wisconsin Lakes Partnership was conceived as a polycentric governance system. It is robust because there are many parts of the partnership operating at different scales, all at the same time. There are hundreds of local water groups tackling challenges across thousands of lakes and rivers. They were found in all 72 counties, distributed across dozens of watersheds and several major basins in Wisconsin. County departments, regional partners, and statewide organizations such as Wisconsin Lakes, River Alliance, UW Extension, and the Department of Natural Resources provide support to these local groups on a wide scale. A key to successful polycentric governance is to keep the network together and maintain a tight structure, one that goes beyond information sharing and ad hoc collaboration. The DNR's development of new water protection and AIS prevention contracts through counties in 2020 is an example of formalizing polycentric collaboration in the spirit of resilience.
Taken together, these principles are well reflected in our partnership, but there is work to do. We need to better align monitoring across streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. We need to showcase more examples of watershed protection and restoration that yield positive lake and river outcomes. And we need to continue broadening our participation. Talk to your friends and neighbors about protecting our waters and invite them into the discussion. Let's make healthy waters together.
All right, thank you for joining us for that little sort of learning video covering the topics of resilience. I want to thank Amy Kowalski for putting that together. She did an amazing job in a very short amount of time. I also want to point out that video will be posted on YouTube. There'll be sort of a higher resolution version of it. You can watch sort of on your own time, and you can share it with other people again. The video itself is derived from a book that came out from the Stockholm Resilience Center. So over in Sweden, there's an entire research outfit that's looking at different aspects of resilience. And they put out this book basically based on case studies, and it's a really great resource. We'll link that in the archives as well so that people can tap into that book. All right, we're still pretty close to my planned time, so we're doing good here. I want to segue now into introducing our keynote speaker, who's joining us from his home outside of Madison. I'll give Megan some time to load up his slides. Doug Beard is joining us. He is a Wisconsin native. He was born into a fish-focused family in northwestern Wisconsin. I think he spent some time on Ripley Lake in Washburn County. Doug completed his PhD in zoology, working with Steve Carpenter at UW-Madison in Wisconsin. He completed that in 2003, while at the same time he was working for the DNR as the Treaty Fisheries Program Manager. So if you know something about the late 90s and early 2000s and fisheries in Wisconsin, that was a very contentious time, and Doug was right there in the fray. After graduating, Doug moved to the US Geological Survey headquarters in Virginia, where he eventually came to manage the entire fisheries program for the USGS. He was then asked to lead the development of the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, where he still serves as chief. Please join me in welcoming Doug Beard.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. I am indeed joining you from my house between Stoughton and Deerfield, just southeast of Madison.
I can hear you well, Doug.
Yeah, and on Tuesday, our lovely satellite internet decided that it would no longer work, so we're cobbling together solutions through hotspots. So hopefully, if you lose me, I should come back fairly shortly. But I put it on our most stable hotspot. The other warning I'll give you is that we do have 3 dogs, and if the UPS driver shows up with a delivery, pandemonium will break loose, because the driver's got to be the most evil person on earth, even though they always bring us something as opposed to taking. So if that happens, I'll give you a heads up, and we may have to take a 30-second break as they bark their heads off. Yeah, as Eric mentioned, I've started actually my career with the Minnesota DNR. It was very short, but then ended up at Wisconsin DNR, worked there for 13 years, started in 90, left in 2003, moved to the Washington, D.C. area in 2003, took a job with the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, which is a suburb of D.C., spent 16 years in D.C., and then about a year ago, as part of a negotiation regarding job change, I negotiated away God's country, and I'm so quite happy to be here. So I think we can go ahead with the next slide. What I want to do today is essentially talk about how we actually implement resilience, or how we're thinking about implementing it, or how we actually have been doing in our climate arena. And before I do that, I want to just give you a little background. Like Marco, who will come after me, I was trained as a part of the Resilience Alliance with Steve Carpenter, and sort of him and his colleagues, Buzz Holling and others, who actually sort of identified and built this concept. And I think the video did a very good job of illustrating sort of the 7 key points that we talk about. And it's essentially it's a way to think about managing yourself through change, because change is a constant. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, but in the end, all of us want something from our natural environment. And by thinking about the concept through this resilience cycle, you can sort of help manage that trajectory as opposed to responding to it. So next slide. So we actually did some of this work as part of my PhD work years ago with Steve and others through the Resilience Alliance. And when we actually did put together a group that was, we would call multidisciplinary, but essentially it brings together not only biologists and water folks, but it's sociologists and systems thinkers and operations folks with the local community. And we had a number of people from the local community, including tribal representation. We had, I think, a member, it was done in Vilas or Oneida County, I can't remember exactly which. And we had a member of the Vilas County Council. We had tribal member from Lac Flambeau. We had our local reporter. And we had just a few concerned citizens. In fact, we probably had people from Wisconsin Association of Lakes. And the goal there was to meld science with management options. So truly identify what people want from systems, and then use our scientific tools to help illustrate what's possible. I'll talk about this a little bit later. We've called this co-management, a term we use in the climate arena, but essentially trying to produce science that hits the endpoints that people want in order to provide something from a system. So next slide. So the points that were raised in the video are important, and we tried to apply those. The biggest application of which was this notion of active learning. So what can we learn from the citizens and vice versa, and not try to set up sort of a, well, the scientists know best approach, but instead have the scientists actually work to incorporate the citizens' concerns into whatever direction they were interested in pushing the system. And we ended up building a series of scenarios. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the notion of scenarios. It's a very complicated subject. They're used a lot in the climate community, but they're used all over. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. Let me this is where we worked. We were looking, just for those who don't know, the Northern Highland area. We had, essentially worked in the Vilas and Oneida counties. So let's go to the next slide. We built this complex model, and this actually is a very much simplified model that allowed us to identify the various drivers of change, the actors or the people in the middle of it, identify the various linkages, and then talk about the ecology. So when we talk about drivers of change, remember this was 20 years ago almost now. Some of these certainly have changed, but what are the things that we think are both fast and slow? Remember that term, slow variable, that essentially managers can actually manage around in order to drive a system in a direction in which people would prefer as opposed to reacting to it. So the next slide, please. Yeah, and so I'll get back to the scenario. So this is the scenarios part that I will talk about. And as I said, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because it is a fairly complex subject. But essentially what we try to do is build a series of 3 or 4 scenarios or potential, the way that the term we use is plausible outcomes. Scenarios are not meant to be forecasts or predictions of the future. It's instead they're supposed to illustrate sort of a direction a system can go depending on how the human community and the natural community interact. And these can usually what we try to do is build them through a series of sort of the most extremes on both ends. So, in light of a better way to think of it, so sort of the very green extreme where we manage to have we manage very heavily for conservation, sometimes at the expense of other things, or the very non-green extreme, perhaps, where we've de-emphasized the importance of the ecology as opposed to continuing with economic endpoints or other endpoints that aren't always taking into account impacts. And so what you're trying to do is look at the contrast between those outcomes and see where there's some similarities may lie, because the true solution is always going to be somewhere in the middle. And so what are the various points that people can push on and pull on to actually affect meaningful change? So, so that's a bit it on scenarios. I won't talk much more about them other than to say, just to remind people, when you hear that word, you really need to think about them as plausible outcomes, not forecast predictions. That's not what we're doing. It's not what they do in the climate community. They're just illustrating possible trajectories, and almost everyone that works in this arena understands that none of these will be completely true. So next slide. So that's great, and that is sort of my background and sort of the theory and sort of where I worked and the things that I was thinking about at the time. But one of the things that I always thought was one of the biggest challenges with resilience theory, and I still think it's true today, is but how do you actually implement it? It's a great theory, and it really is very effective in explaining change. But then for most on-the-ground managers or others, how do you actually take that and put it into practice? And that's always, I think, been one of the biggest challenges about the resilience theory itself, is how do we actually take that and use it to do something. And what I'm going to do through the rest of this talk is illustrate how we're doing it centered around climate, and give you a couple examples of where we've been doing this to illustrate that you can take the various points and put them in practice. So next slide, please. One of the first problems we've run into, and I don't want you to read this because it's not, the point here isn't to read these definitions, but the notion of resilience and its definition is inconsistent across professions. So that's, and you'll find that when we talk, especially in the scientific realm, my view of how resilience is defined, which is one of the ecological views, may not at all line up with how an economist views it, or traditional economists certainly may not line up with how an engineer might view it. So we haven't spent a lot of time using that word because of the sort of inconsistency in how people understand it. Instead, what we've focused on, which is the next slide, please, next slide, is actually taking the principles that you all just heard about and putting them into play at various parts of our climate adaptation planning. So all the things that were illustrated in that video, which was very well done, we've actually are trying to put in practice. So we talk about using these principles as opposed to the term resilience itself. And little did I know that there are also 7 principles of the Constitution. So when I was looking around for cartoon, that's the first thing that popped up. So the odd thing was I could only ever count 6, but I guess there's 7. I don't know what the 7th is. So next slide. So I'm going to move to the bulk of this conversation now, which is viewing resilience through an adaptation lens. And we use this notion and what we call climate adaptation planning. And I'm going to illustrate through some examples and process about how we do this. And next slide, please. And just sort of a shameless plug for our enterprise, and this, I promise this will be the only one. We are a series of regional climate adaptation science centers, and our whole goal has been to work with the fish, wildlife, and their habitat community to build climate, which is in some respects the epitome of a slow variable, into management planning. We call it adaptation. It's essentially helping managers sort of manage the trajectory of climate-induced impacts and move the system in a direction they prefer. Next slide. And how we do this is through this sort of shared learning process, this co-management process in which we, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, which is the red box in the bottom, work on the science end, knowing full well that we need to get engagement to really identify what people want from agencies, tribal governments, national NGOs, private landowners, and then work directly with the management agencies to feed science into their planning. So that's how we've set our organization up. I will say that we've done a lot of this. We have hired some people that work specifically in this idea of structured decision-making or structured decision approaches. It is a time-intensive process, but we think that it's worth the investment because the outcomes ought to actually affect change, and that's why we've invested so heavily in this model. Next slide, please. So the notion that we've used is co-management that leads to actionable science. And so we're providing usable information on which to base policy decisions. And we've kind of thought of ourselves as a boundary organization where we're actually can span the dip between the policy and user domain and the science domain, providing answers or solutions to those that prefer to, that are trying to actually do active management on the ground. One thing I forgot to mention up front is that US Geological Survey does not have any management or policy mission, part of its mission. We are a science agency only, so we have policy informative science, but we do not do policy prescriptive science. So it really is up to management agencies and those that are making decisions to use the science as they see fit. We think this is a better model than the traditional science model. The traditional science model is we would often come to a management community, get a series of questions, we'd run off, disappear for 2 or 3 years, and then come back 3 years later and say, here's an answer. But by that time, management communities may have moved on. That question may no longer be relevant. As we see how rapidly COVID is overspreading the nation, of course, managing health systems has responding quickly, and so being engaged with the policy choice up front is important in terms of being able to feed science into the endpoint. Next slide, please. So a few points just to reiterate these. We do policy relevant, not prescriptive science. Our goal is to give decision makers a variety of choices. Usually that's based on their own view of how risky they want to be in their management. It should reflect what people want from a system. We try to make it understandable. We try to make it available when it's needed. And we get people working together from the start. It's this learning thing, the learning part, which we think is really critical to having effective resource management and adaptation. And that's sort of how we built our entire enterprise. We're actually exploring even new directions in how we actually provide almost a climate services sort of idea, because a lot of folks that aren't in the climate community have struggled over the years in how you actually use climate information. So next slide. So adaptive management is, I've always viewed as sort of a variation on the resilience theory, and in fact, it builds a lot of the notions, the 7 principles into it. So we have tended to, one of the solutions that we have developed, my group, working broadly with the resource community around the United States, is doing adaptive management is sort of a process by which we actually feed science and actually actively learn from it. So next slide. And again, just to reiterate, what we're trying to do is adapt, and this actually comes straight out of the climate community, keep our system or our needs in this adaptive space. So we keep, by implementing adaptive management, which is based on the principles of resilience, it allows us to keep pushing the system in the direction we want. Not change is inevitable, and in some respects, especially with climate and others, it's going to be impossible to stop in the short term. So how do we keep pushing it through this white space so that you're happy with what the system provides, whether that's watching wildlife. In my case, I fish a lot. Can I still be fishing? And what do I fish for? And those sorts of things. So next slide, please. So the first thing that the management community needs to do is actually understand what their desired outcomes are. What do you want from a system? What are the services? And sort of it's basically, ecosystem service is a bit of a jargon, and we refer to it as the nature's, in another 4-hour working, we actually started referring to it as nature's benefits to people. So what do you want? You want to go fishing, you want food, you want clean water. Those are all important, what we would call in the science language, services, but they're really the benefits we all derive from a healthy, functioning Earth. And it's oftentimes cheaper than sort of putting in sort of water purification plants and other. So this classic example out of New York State that illustrates that. And then if you can't actually maintain the current system, are there realistic other options? I mean, I think there is a realism, sort of, especially in how we meld together the various sorts of uses of the landscape, with everybody wanting a variety of different benefits from that. Next slide. So in many respects, especially with climate, we're standing at a crossroads. We can either document change and delay decisions, or we can be more proactive in how we manage things and acknowledge sometimes we'll be wrong, and that's all right. But if we are wrong, we have to be able to step in and make a change. So it really is up to communities to decide how to take this. And as it says up there, delaying a decision is a decision. I mean, if you choose to do nothing, then of course you're just going to be at the mercy of whatever the direction the drivers are going to take you. Next slide. So this is the very traditional adaptive management cycle where you define your objectives, you assess the system, you design a solution, you implement, you adapt and repeat. The learning comes in throughout this system, and we integrate it into our entire overall process. Next slide, please. What we've started to put together and some of our scientists are working on is a sort of something we call the RAD framework, which is resist, accept, and direct. So it sort of acknowledges that your front line, and we've known this for a variety of different scientific studies, that resisting change to return to the historical condition is often the most effective solution if it's available and the slow drivers aren't out of our control. I work on something called the National Fish Habitat Board. Their number one goal is to protect the systems they have. And you'll see that illustrated in this Tulibee example I have coming in a few minutes. But if you are going to have change, accept it and make sure you direct that change to away from undesirable outcomes. Essentially exactly what resilience would tell you to do. Next slide. So you have to do this, and you have to constantly check in with your system to make sure that you're actually going in the direction you want. This isn't we're going to do it once and then come back 20 years and hope it happened. This is an ongoing commitment to actually help derive things into the space you want it to be. Next slide. Case in point, and a lot of this came out of some work we were doing in the Kenai in Alaska. For those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a little peninsula that sticks out just southwest of Anchorage. And Alaska right now, and most of the Arctic, is on the forefront of change. We're seeing rapid change in this region. And one of the issues they have is what are they going to do with the Kenai if that change occurs? Next slide. Oh, shoot. Yeah, transition didn't work there, Megan. That's one of the things with the PDF. So essentially, I'll just talk about it. Right now they have a moose-based system up there, but they're actually thinking in the Kenai that's going to go to more grasslands because it's going to warm up significantly. Some of the fir forests are going to change. And they're actually contemplating what comes next. Is that something that they turn over and manage for more of a grassland system, which may include things like American bison, which of course are not native to Alaska. So these are the sorts of debates that go on when you have these long, slow variables that are driving systems in directions you don't want. They still want to have systems that are operating, that provide wildlife opportunities, whether that be hunting or viewing or other things. And maybe those change from moose to bison. And that's the realism that I think many people in Alaska are coming to see. And there's a whole litany of examples from Alaska that illustrate sort of the challenges that they're undergoing right now. But I'm going to bring it back to a couple examples closer to home. We worked years ago when I first started this initiative with the Minnesota DNR and sort of trying to build climate output into their lake temperature modeling. And in fact, I'll give you an example that I got from Jordan Reed and Gretchen Hansen. The second example, we're doing something similar in Wisconsin. This is some work that was done by Pete Jacobson and the Minnesota DNR, in which they were really concerned about the distribution of Cisco in some of their cold water systems. Cisco are cold water dependent. They need rich cold water with a very oxygenated bottom of the lake. And when that starts to disappear, Cisco can no longer thrive. And they're important iconic species in Minnesota and actually throughout most of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes states. Next slide. They started noticing these declines starting in 1970s. Minnesota's had a long-standing lake monitoring program. They've watched these animals disappear from many of their lakes. And we're starting to grow very concerned about what was driving this. And that's when we got involved on the climate side. Next slide. And in fact, what they were seeing was sort of a warming of the lakes combined with lack of oxygen in the hypolimnion that was causing mortality events. And so, you're getting higher biological oxygen demand, and animals, cold water, as probably most of you know, holds more oxygen, but not when it has a lot of other things going on in there. In fact, probably inputs of nutrients and other things that are driving biological demand, oxygen demand, much higher than was traditional in these systems. Next slide, please. So what Minnesota has been doing, they realize that they're not going to be able to protect all 648 lakes. It's not realistic. There's some land use issues that have essentially make that impossible. What they have not done instead is to identify 176 refuge lakes in which they're now very actively managing the riparian corridor, so trying to control nutrient input into these waters, using some traditional fish management techniques to limit harvests and other impacts, try to limit the spread of invasive species and other things that could impact these. So they've basically been realistic about what they can do. They're not going to stop sort of these broad, long climate drivers, but they can minimize the impact by doing just sound resource management. Next slide. So planting trees, forest improvements, erosion control. They've also have a very targeted acquisition and easement program where they're emphasizing buying parcels on these water bodies to protect them from further development, whether that be farming or other lakeshore development, and just provide the natural environment so that they can help to resist, go back to the RAD framework, resist change. Next slide. Similarly, Wisconsin, we've been working with this group, Wiki. They've become more active in the last couple of years. We worked with them early on, and then there was a little bit of change, and now they just last couple of years, they're starting to ramp up again. But we've been working with Jordan Reed at the US Geological Survey and Gretchen Hansen, who was at the Wisconsin DNR, I believe, for a while, now is up at the University of Minnesota, trying to basically do something similar for Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin lakes. Next slide. Wisconsin's going to get warmer, just like everybody else. Some stuff from Wiki, 3 to 9 degrees by mid-21st century projected. Next slide. As importantly, and for someone who's myself, whose true love of fishing is on the ice, I prefer hard water fishing. Wisconsin winters are going to warm significantly. And we've been seeing it in the ice data from down here in southern Wisconsin. The ice-on period was pretty short this year. I did manage to get a fair amount of fishing in that time frame. I can see, if not in my lifetime, but perhaps my kids' lifetimes, where that ice fishing season down here in southern Wisconsin is eventually going to come to an end. And that's sort of driven by changes in winter temperatures. Next slide. So what does this mean for Wisconsin? Well, as you all know, at least most of you are Wisconsinites, walleye is king in the north. As Eric mentioned, I started my career at the treaty program, spent most of my time there. And so it is king. And there's some worry about what's happening in these waters. Next slide. Just like Minnesota, our lakes are going to be warmer in the future. Next slide. And we know that inland fishing contributes about $1 billion to Wisconsin's economy. These lakes are going to get warmer, and they're important because they control our fish communities, how fish grow, survive, and reproduce in the lakes. Next slide. We've already, some data that Gretchen compiled and published a while ago, we've already started to see a shift from a cool water species, which is walleye, to a warm water dominated species, which is bass in northern Wisconsin lakes. And for those of you that are from that region, that's where I grew up. I grew up in the Spooner area. My mom still lives up there. That's a substantial change because people in that part of the world built their entire tourism and their own personal lives around fishing for walleye. The question will be, will they switch and continue to fish for bass? Next slide. And so if we project this out, and again, this is some data from Jordan Reed, we're going to see a fairly significant shift from walleye dominant lakes to bass dominant lakes. And the question or the challenge for the DNR is, how do you manage around that? Obviously, they put a fair amount of time in sort of stocking. Stocking does have its limitations, but it is a way to at least accept or to at least sort of help drive change to some respects. But there may be a point in time where even that won't be effective because the waters will just not be cool enough to provide a growth habitat for these animals. So next slide. So I'm just going to finish up with a series of pointers here and illustrate that incorporating resilience into your lake management is not rocket science. Honestly, it's just sound resource management. That's what we tell people on climate. It's sound resource management. Avoid paralysis. You have to be actively engaged in the system. Monitoring. It's, from a government perspective, it may be the hardest thing I've sold over the years to try to continue to invest in, but it provides us the best source of information to track change. Try some new things. Don't be afraid to experiment. You can reduce your uncertainty that way. We're working right now with Madison and University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point on a project in northern Wisconsin to see if we can affect change through experimentation on a couple lakes up there, trying to drive them back from a bass, bluegill dominated system back to a walleye system. We'll see. Hopefully it'll work. If it doesn't, then we'll learn. And there's not really no one solution all the time. Sometimes it's an amalgam of various things. So next couple slides. Prioritize those responses that are flexible and adaptive. And at least from my seat, manage the non-climate stressors. Managing non-climate itself is a challenge the globe faces. But as a local manager, you can control land use, development, growth, how people access these animals, how they use them. And a point that's been made, and I didn't get much into this because we're talking about lakes, but we do a lot of this connectivity issue, this coordination across landscapes. It isn't critical. The Department of Interior right now has a big initiative on wildlife corridors, trying to provide those sort of corridors between healthy patches for wildlife to migrate in and about as a result of various sort of climate drivers. Next slide. And yeah, these are all just tools that we have in our management system. We directly manage populations, we have regulations, we limit harvest, we do everything we can to control invasive species. We're spending a lot on carp these days, Asian carp. Be active, monitor, take active approaches, get engaged, try to make a difference, experiment. That's how we'll actually be able to manage resilience within our own lake systems. Next slide. So yeah, this is an important quote. I've always liked it. This gentleman, of course, people should know who he is. I've always spent my entire career trying to work at the interface between science and management. I understand the need for a basic understanding of how the earth operates because I actually cannot do actionable science without that basic understanding. But I always want to be in the middle of that. So actually applying our science to our best outcomes. in trying to provide the benefits that people want from our natural system. So I think that's it. There's one more slide, Megan, and that's the ubiquitous sunset slide. I've been fortunate in my life. I've been able to do a lot of work around the globe. This is some work I was actually doing in Laos. This is the Mekong River. I didn't go into much on river systems at all, but there's huge issues in the Mekong. I'm sitting in Laos. We're looking at Thailand. And these systems are being rapidly modified for a variety of different reasons. And I guess I'll just leave it there, and I guess we turn it over to Marco.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. That was a very informative overview from your perspective there at USGS. We did invite someone to join us sort of as a discussant, and we kind of use this time period here as a transition. We would like to see you ask questions. This is sort of the value of the in-person meeting. And remember, on your toolbar, you have down at the bottom there a Q&A panel, and you can click on Q&A and you can type in your questions. You can also look at the questions that other people have asked, and you'll be able to vote them up, and that'll move them to the top of the queue. But we'd love to see you composing your questions for Doug, and then we'll come back to those. But first, we're going to have we're going to have Marco Janssen give sort of a response and kind of color commentary to Doug's presentation. Dr. Janssen works out of Arizona State University, and that's where he's joining us from. He did all of his research based out of the Netherlands, so you might notice his Dutch accent. So he doesn't sound like he's from Arizona, but he's definitely coming at us from Arizona. And at Arizona, he's a professor in the School of Sustainability. He's a senior sustainability scientist at the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. And he's also the director at the Center for Behavior, Institutions, and the Environment within the College of Letters and Sciences at Arizona State. And part of why we wrap Marco into this is that he and his students have been doing some interesting research up in Vilas County, sort of following the work that Doug mentioned 20 years ago and looking at lake organizations in particular. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Doug and just encourage you all to check out the Q&A panel.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thanks for the, I want to thank Douglas for the nice presentation. It's also interesting to see how we have progressed in the last 20 years, because I worked with Doug about 20 years ago when we were studying lakes in Wisconsin. Actually, the lakes in Wisconsin have an important role in the whole resilience community. Steve Carpenter was mentioned, and his research provide a lot of insights to the quality of resilience of ecosystems. So a lot of people around the world know Wisconsin for their lakes and how lakes are impacted by input of nutrients and how that may impact the resilience of systems. And 20 years ago, we were working very much on debates about definitions and more theoretical models. And so it's interesting to see how this work is now used in a more practical way. And given the current situation, that it shows that actually the community of people in Wisconsin working on lakes are resilient, being able to adapt to this change in this conference to a virtual one in a very short time. A lot of my research is focused more on the social science part of this, and as Eric mentioned, we will have at the next session, there will be a session on lake organizations, and some of our research will be presented there. So in a way, Wisconsin is an interesting platform for us to study resilience and how communities deal with a lot of the challenges that the lake organizations have. So one of the kind of the questions that I have, and maybe also some of the participants is, of course, we are now living in a situation that we are exposed to surprises. And 20 years ago, when we talk a lot about resilience in a more conceptual way, we knew that we don't know what the future will bring us, but we have to be ready for surprises. And so now we are really confronted with a big surprise. We knew that something like this could happen, but now we have to deal with it. And one of the challenges now, of course, that the coming summer will be quite different for all of us, and how to kind of engage with the landscapes and the lakes. So how can lake organizations, what will be important for them? Because there might be less people coming up to these to the lakes that might have impacts for monitoring. There might be less ability to meet, so we may have to, like we do today, explore all kind of virtual ways to meet and to maintain the communities. One question I have for Doug is, what will be important kind of lessons from your perspective? What should be priorities for this community to work on this summer? Because we have to make choices about what should we be able to continue given the current situation.
So I think that's an invitation for Doug to
Yes.
kind of think about the context now of COVID-19, sort of the public health crisis, and how that maybe affects the paths that we can take, at least in the short term, right? About
yes, and we talked about it last week, that you are also thinking about ways to respond. So this is I think a question that a lot of us will do. I don't know whether this is a kind of a question that maybe nobody really has a perfect answer for, but it will be, I think, something that we concretely need to think about.
And Doug, I want to see if you got your mic still with us. You may need to unmute yourself.
Eric?
I can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, no, this is a problem with hotspots. I didn't catch the end of Marco's comment there, but I think the issue is, how do we, given the sort of the challenges we think we'll face through the summer in terms of our, continuing to social distance, and how that will affect sort of our ability to collect traditional monitoring data from lakes. And certainly we're facing that in the survey. We've spent the last, in fact, yesterday we were going over our field work monitoring guidelines, in which we will allow people to continue to do mission critical and life and property monitoring. We have a broader mission around flooding with the water program, around volcanoes and earthquake monitoring, and those are really life and property monitoring that we need to continue. And so we do have some protocols on how we do that, but unfortunately, I think sort of monitoring lake temperature or water quality would be one of those things that would traditionally go by the wayside, and sort of underneath this, even our criteria on what we would deem critical to continue. One of the challenges that we've taken this as a challenge, though, and I think it's a time to sort of ramp up how we use non-traditional approaches to monitoring, and sort of through remote and sensor-based technologies. In fact, our director has been pushing very hard for development of more technologies that we can deploy that are less dependent on humans, and can it still provide a much more broader monitoring swath than we could normally get through sending people out with Secchi disc or thermometers. And so he's put that challenge before us as an agency, because he would like to see, he's interested in expanding our monitoring, and he realizes that isn't going to be done through the backs of our scientific core, I mean, there is some real limitations. So one of the things we need to think about is how do we now integrate sort of remote sense techniques with our traditional monitoring. And we've done some work over the years with using satellite and other imagery to look at chlorophyll A concentrations in lake systems. And you actually can generate fairly interesting data from that. And how does that compare with a more traditional monitoring? So there's some real science challenges there. We know that we can also monitor flow and discharge of larger rivers through remote-based techniques, but we don't do a lot of it. Our USGS gauging stations are now going towards a much more rapid online sort of electronic monitoring, so we get real-time, almost real-time, better than we had been, changes on everything besides just flow. And that's a sensor technique that the water program is working on. So for us as a science community, I'd say the challenge is how do we now, recognizing we're likely going to have a dearth of monitoring this traditional monitoring data, how do we now integrate non-traditional sources with traditional sources? And in fact, what may come out of the other end, I hope, is a more robust system of monitoring that actually builds that out. As I said earlier, monitoring is one of the most difficult things to sell to funders in terms of its importance, but I think all of us that work in the science community and the management community understand its critical. And so go ahead. Yeah.
One of the questions that people ask is very similar to what you're addressing too, about how do you get people to understand the importance of monitoring? And I think it is establishing what sort of the range of normality is, but it's also trying to establish what the trends are that are happening from place A to place B across the landscape. I can envision, and I don't know if you've thought about this, I mean, the volunteer monitoring that we do with Secchi discs to ground truth clarity, historically that's kind of been limited to the lakes where the volunteers are sitting at. We found it hard to get volunteers to go to what I'd call like target lakes, or lakes that we have gaps in the data for, to ground truth the satellite imagery. And it seems, at least in my mind, I don't know how things are going to play out in the coming months, but a husband and a wife, packing the canoe and going to a lake with a Secchi disc, people who have they've been trained on how to use the Secchi disc, and monitoring water clarity on lakes that nobody's really gone out to look at clarity before. They have public access, and doing that on the satellite days. We know what the satellite days are when the satellite is flying over Wisconsin, and if it's a clear day, we get that ground truth data. It seems like this would be a good year to try to coordinate something more wholeheartedly around that. If the travel restrictions permit people, in a couple situation, or even an individual on a kayak, to go out and monitor, do you see something like that as a plausible way to sort of make the best of 2020?
Yeah, I'll even go one step farther. We've been, the use of drones and the ability to put sensors on drones has expanded immensely. You can now get drones with small drones with sensor packages. The next generation of satellites are going to be smaller, with much higher imagery in terms of the scale. It won't be at the 30 meter pixels, or I'll get this wrong. So I think it's time that we start building out that sort of technology and taking use of it. And this may be you're exactly right, Eric. This is maybe the year we're going to have to do that. We may have no choice. I mean, yeah, if you're sitting on your lake and you can properly social distance and go out and get your traditional readings, that's great. But sort of teams of people, it's going to be much more difficult. And so for us as a science agency, that's one of the big challenges we're trying to deal with here in the next couple of years. And I think this summer is going to give us a real interesting ability to do that. Monitoring, it's simple when it comes to life and property monitoring, like our flooding monitoring with our gauging stations, our volcano, our earthquake stuff. We have no trouble selling that, but it's sort of monitoring that tracks these slow variables is which becomes very difficult. So we say, hey, we need to have 30 years of lake water temperature data so we can see what's really going on. And people it's just a hard sell because change is slow. and it's so illustrating those uses. And I think the climate community has been able to put some of that together it's been helpful, but the more we can do that, I think the better off we all are.
Sure. Another popular question in the Q&A had to do with kind of thinking about maybe what's happening at the federal level right now in terms of policy and funding priorities. Absent of what's been happening in the last few weeks with the pandemic, we had seen fairly explicit rollbacks of regulations and changes. And always in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, how is it that the USGS sort of manages to persist? Something must be designed into your institution that allows the US Geological Survey to be resilient to changes in politics at the federal level. Can you give us a little insight into how the USGS works, and how is it that your office hasn't been completely, defunded in this era?
Yeah, in fact, we got my group got a 50% increase last year, just to illustrate sort of a climate group. So we went, our base funding increased it by 50%. So one of the advantages the survey has is that we don't have a policy or regulatory role. So we often are seen as the neutral science provider. That has pluses and minuses. The plus is we're not, the policies that are rolled out by the management side of Interior or EPA, that's can be based on our science output or not, but we don't ever recommend a policy prescriptive outcome. So we provide the science. It's really up for the administrations, and administrations all have different emphases on things they want to prioritize in terms of how they implement regulatory and other policies. And so all we can do is provide science. The downside is all we do is provide science. So we often have a hard time illustrating how important our science is in a series of decision outcomes. It's very easy for things like I've mentioned before, the sort of life and property things. It gets a little more difficult as you go off to just sort of the basic understanding of a carbon cycle. You can't implement adaptive management if you don't understand how the carbon cycle or the hydrological cycle works. It's just impossible. But that's a hard sell, because you're often 2 or 3 steps away from a management outcome. And so how do you convince people those, this sort of basic understanding eventually leads to someone being able to do something meaningful? So that's always been our challenge. We've actually been all right during this administration in terms of our funding. We've, like I said, our program got a fairly significant increase from Congress last year. Overall, the survey had an increase. We do a lot of things on invasive species, which is a huge priority for this administration and Congress. So a lot of work in Asian carp, a lot of other things. But I think essentially that, Eric, it's generally, we're definitely not a political agency. We don't get engaged. We only have one political appointee, and that's our director. Everybody else is career. So we tend to maintain through administrations and directors. We have a fundamental science process that the directors all respect and adhere to assure that there isn't political interference in the outcome of our science. And so I think that's allowed us to remain sort of a neutral body in terms of this whole discussion.
Great. Yeah, I got a question from Allison with the DNR. She likes the idea of these scenario planning exercises and thinking about alternate futures. But she's wondering, what do we look to for a resource? Is there a handbook? Is there something that you're familiar with from Resilience Alliance or from other work that kind of gives not quite a template, but at least a guidebook for walking through scenario building?
Yeah, and Marco maybe is well placed to answer this as I am. So I've been working on another platform called the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and we have actually about 2016, I guess that's 4 years ago now. Time flies when you're having fun. Produced a current assessment of what we knew about scenarios and modeling in the environmental biodiversity community. So that document is sort of summarizes what we knew till about probably 2015, sort of a guidebook of what tools are out there, what scenarios are used, what models people have available to use. They're now working on an extension of that, which is to create a set of common scenarios that can be used broadly, regardless of sort of the overall, where you are in the world or overall output. So that's one source that I think is coming on, is available for people to look at. The Park Service, we worked with them a while ago. They've created a number of scenarios specific for national parks that they use. But there is sort of one of the real challenges is there are a lot of these out there, and what is, what would be useful for you versus in Wisconsin versus what, is useful for someone in Montana or Alaska or in the Arctic or something like that. And so there is sort of that challenge still remains, but maybe Marco might have some answers too.
So yeah, the Resilience Alliance has been working on some handbooks for practitioners. I do not know the current status is of that, but I will find out and share this with Eric to share this with the rest of this community.
Yeah, so people can check out Resilience Alliance. If you Google that specific term, that'll get you to some of their resources. And then I'd also encourage people to check out the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is in Sweden, and they are also publishing these resources. We have time for one more question. There was a fisheries related question that I think Doug might be able to field. I'm trying to see where it went. There it is. The question comes from one of your colleagues, Dale Robertson, wants to know if you think the past changes in walleye and bass were caused by people selectively harvesting more walleye than bass, or is it the sort of temperature regime changes that are driving this? What role has harvesting and fisheries played in the walleye population?
Yeah, so the simple answer is probably both, and it's probably hard to tease apart the short term and the long. And this is the problem of faster and slow variables, which we talk about a lot in resilience. When I did my dissertation on that exact similar sort of question of that, at that point it appeared that the regime we put in for managing walleyes was holding, and we were able to provide sustainability in terms of both for the tribal community and the recreational community. But since then, there was some work done that was published maybe about a little over a year ago, maybe a little less, by some folks at the Center for Limnology. Holly Emke was the lead author on it, that suggested that there has been sort of over-harvest of walleyes, at least in the last few years. So there's sort of the production to keep up with sort of the demand. That could also been driven by an underlying climate dynamic that we just don't know about. So it's almost certainly both. But as I said, managing climate is a global problem. Challenge for the DNR will be, how do they pivot to, to control harvest or, to replenish walleye. And that's sort of where the levers they can actually use to actually, to maintain those fisheries up there. And it's pretty clear, at least it looks pretty clear to me from the data that, we're seeing a wholesale change. And obviously for those communities, especially the ones that are tourism-based, that are dependent on that seasonal summer walleye fishery, that's going to have big implications.
Yeah, and it could be that pressure to harvest walleye goes up in the summer. We're not sure yet. Well, we're approaching the time where I got to wrap this up. I do want to give credit to all the people who typed questions. I think what we will do is actually the platform allows us to capture those questions and download sort of the text that's in there. And I might put that out there as a document that we can use to share with both Doug and Marco, try to get some good responses to those over time and post that in our archives. I want to extend my thank you to Doug Beard and Marco Janssen. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
I'll give another plug. Marco and his researchers will be in a session that starts in just about 6 minutes. There's sort of a social science section in the Lake and River Science stream, but there's also going to be several other streams. We're going to look to try to keep the trains running on time, so those sessions will start at 10:40. So take a moment to, you probably know where your restrooms are located. You know where the snacks are hidden in your own house. But again, thank you everybody for joining us for the plenary, and we'll be back in this plenary webinar format tomorrow in the morning as well. So thank you everybody.